Thank you, all the speakers. I'm quite amazed about the variety of the ways how we can act and have our practices today. Now we will invite you all back to the stage for a panel discussion. Before that, I would like to introduce the moderator of the fourth panel, Meneesha Kellay. Meneesha is curator of festivals in the Design, Architecture and Digital team at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London. Previously, she ran Open House London, was a curator at the Museum of Architecture and assistant director of Night School at the Architectural Association. More recently, Meneesha was public programs curator at the Royal Institute of British Architects. A defining program of her time there was the Europa Talks series, which brought together 32 European practices from 15 countries, including the Baltic states. The talks were organized by countries that share a border, and the aim was to explore the commonalities and differences and open a space for productive discourse with UK audiences. Thank you. So, Meneesha. Oh, speakers.
Half an hour to go.
Would you like to join me? Do you want to take a seat? Thank you. I'd firstly like to say thank you to the curators, Dagny and Dina, for inviting me to moderate this final discussion. I do consider myself a kind of cheerleader for the Baltics, because I, was first introduced to the region through the Baltic Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2016. I had the pleasure of working with the team there and have since brought the exhibition to the Royal Institute of British Architects and to the Architectural Association for the Baltic Materials Assembly's joint exhibition. I loved how the exhibition in Venice celebrated the commonalities present in the States that, from an outsider's perspective at least, gave the Baltic region a clear identity and unity. I think the Baltic Chain is perhaps the epitome of this. You're probably all aware of this, but for those of you who aren't from the Baltic region, the Baltic Chain was a peaceful protest demonstration in 1989 where 2 million people joined hands to form a human chain spanning 675 kilometers across Ethiopia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, displaying the popular desire for independence in each of the countries, but also solidarity between them. And it is such a beautiful symbol of solidarity that has been used by protest groups in Hong Kong recently, and by women in India earlier this year who were protesting against gender discrimination. And so, yeah, I'm kind of digressing, but there was a moment in the Baltic Pavilion, which some of you may remember, where the curators spontaneously broke out in song to wake up the Baltics. Wake Up the Baltic States, is that right? Yeah, it's an amazing song. So I feel like there is a real kind of hope and optimism that's kind of being digested and spread in the Baltic states, and it's kind of really exciting to be here to witness that. But before I move into the direct questions, I would firstly like a show of hands. How many of you live and work in a different country to the country in which you were born? That includes the speakers. So it's a fair amount of people here. So I think this conference has successfully broken down migration as a catch-all term, and has reinforced that migration is, in fact, a way of life, or just a fact of life. I love Justinian's quote yesterday that migration, all is migration, and migration is all. Our challenge now is to confront established narratives around this and to celebrate the richness that migration brings. So, Ignacio, thank you for waking us up with that mad video from MIA. And I actually live in Peckham, and I can assure you it's not like that all the time, but there are kind of elements of that kind of cultural milieu that's brewing there. That's so exciting. And so you have talked about new forms of being together, being characteristic of a life in transit, of belonging as contentious affiliation, as one that is defined by displacement and disjuncture. The challenge of architecture is actually how to build cohesive, integrated communities that cope and even thrive on this flux. So how do we do this? You know, can we collectively design a blueprint that transcends borders and boundaries? You touched on this, or you know, perhaps the Hamburg project is a blueprint. Is that something that you can see being spread all around the world, where there is a kind of migration discussion, or a kind of migration problem that needs to be resolved?
So thank you for the question. I don't think it's easy. First of all, it's not easy even to define migration, because sure, like as you were saying, migration is all, but there are so many types of migration and relations between migration and colonialism, and before it was posed today that we are all migrants, and still we want to defend the rights of indigenous populations. So there are so many complexities in this question that is very difficult to recognize the rights of all the populations moving around the world while differentiating the migration from colonialism and questions of indigeneity and such. So with such difficulties, of course, how to intervene with architectures that are facilitating certain pluralities that don't lead to processes of assimilation, like the ones I was denouncing in the first case study that I was showing. It's very difficult, and to think that just a blueprint could be kind of spread throughout the world and produce new kind of more plural or cohesive societies would be an error. I think it's important, and in that project I highlight how, for example, in the project that I showed, how different architectural strategies are linked to different ways of management, for example, different strategies that operate beyond the building. And I think that's something that is important to highlight. That's why, for example, I ended with that project of the Apple Press. So I think that is very important to understand how we have to study different situations with their different contingencies, rather than to aim for general strategies, to find what are the modes of intervention even that are relevant in each moment. And architecture might not take the form of a building necessarily, but as in that case, maybe the form of an Apple Press. So I think that that's something that I truly believe, even though I've been showing floor plans of tenements, floor plans of a project for Wilhelmsburg, because I still want to make that relation as relevant as possible, the relation between architecture and migration, to see how architecture operates in processes of assimilation or others that are part of this discussion, while still in other projects highlighting how architects might operate with other ways, not beyond the building.
Oh, I think, Mike, you addressed that in your presentation, certainly in the kind of different modes and this kind of amazing compendium of 100 ways in which we can, architecture can bring people together. So I was really pleased to see that you addressed the refugee crisis head on, and how, you know, newcomers to cities are being located. You really encapsulated the need to change the narrative and make spaces where everyone is welcome. And you really, you used kind of urban design and architecture, building typologies to really illustrate this, more so than I think we've seen in the conference so far. So kind of similar to Ignacio's kind of point here about the architect's role. Like, what is the architect's role in kind of challenging these narratives in migration? Do we, you know, embed ourselves in local government? Do we get out on the streets? You know, this is something that I'd like you all to respond to as well. But Mike.
Well, good question. No, I think there is really a contribution from the architectural community that can help dealing with these issues, but it's also limited in a way. I think what is the basic requirement is that architecture and public space can at least facilitate people their home, you know, like and a place where you feel safe, a place where you can have your basic needs in life, and from there on, of course, there's all sorts of activities that I think should be possible to facilitate to, in the end, develop yourself. So the emancipation factor and the fact that people at least don't have to worry about the roof above their head, I think it's crucial, and it doesn't only count for refugees. It's also I think especially in the cities that are becoming increasingly expensive, I think there's way more people that worry about temporary housing contracts or where can I live in the next year, and I think that's something that I think we are in the world in general are far enough that shouldn't be necessary anymore.
Well, I think the B word as well is guilty of that. So Brexit is, really causing a lot of people to rethink if they're going to live in the UK and how they will survive in that context and as you say, emancipate themselves, thrive. It's really kind of challenging that narrative and thinking about empathy and how we can empathize with people. Would you like to kind of add into this commentary on like architecture of migration specifically before we move into?
Like maybe a few words. During these days, there was quite a lot of attempt to describe, to map, to try to maybe master plan the very huge changes happening, like including not only like migration of people, but migration of knowledge, or like blurring of boundaries in generally in different ways. And I think it's quite important to think also about how a practice before mapping can contribute, meaning being in a situation which is unknown, yet not kind of described as neither a script, neither a diagram or a map. It's not a knowledge yet, but it's an ongoing situation which where a practice like hands-on can actually inform about arising questions, bringing like possible solutions yet before actually knowing. So yeah, I think especially the field of migration, I think is a very field of practicing the reaction.
Yeah, Sille, you were kind of talking about this prototyping and developing and testing. That's really kind of embedded in your practice. And you raised the important question of being aware of our climate footprint, and you touched on the effects of the climate crisis and migration. What design flows do we need to implement in architecture processes to properly address this? Can we prototype scenarios where we build cities with sustainable timber and materials rather than concrete and steel? What kind of prototyping efforts can we do to lead to that solution that we need to come to urgently?
I think I will quickly continue where you were, but it seems to me what you're saying, this hands-on and actually being actively part of creating and prototyping this is really similar to how I would describe an artistic research that I'm doing. That you are put into a plural situation. You are one part. You are the artist, the maker, the one that is part of this. And of course, if you have a migration or like if you have a situation close to you, next to you, then it's something that keeps you inside of understanding or like making you to do this, and then the other side, you're an observer. You're somebody who's mapping. You're creating the certain understandings, and then this duality is, I think, is quite of a fruitful way of bringing in the new knowledge. And I think in my terms of what we do is, I think that prototyping has become too much of an end result, that architecture happens when the building is built or something is finalized or constructed. But I see the necessity of actually having outputs or certain understanding what are those protocols that you are implementing in your work are giving us already prior the finalization. That means, of course, as we know, not all of us architects can tackle even the architecture scale. We often remain into the prototypical scale of designing pavilions or proposals. But still, I see the fact when we can disassemble the building or the understanding of a building into smaller bits and pieces or to elements that we can figure out certain things already with the material embedded, and again, like bringing back from the screens where a lot of where I see a lot of my students or where I see a lot of experimental architects' eyes are situated. I think we should bring it back to the physical world and having much more of a material, like design input from the material itself. Not as an end result of your finalizing your hand skills.
That's very interesting. Keiti, you talked about areas being more than rural or less than urban. I thought it was a really kind of interesting quote. And Marcus talked this morning about cities as the operating system from where the distribution of wealth can be dispersed to rural areas. That's kind of contentious in some ways. Or do we need to look at or look to examples of the circular economy to reinvigorate the relationship between the rural and the urban, so they have more of a codependent relationship where the success of the urban isn't to the detriment of the rural, but shared progress and prosperity. You know, do you see this being viable, or will it always be this, as we say, blurry area?
It depends on what kind of a region or location we are looking at. I think in every case this is different. So, but I think my aim was really to think about if we talk about architecture or the spatial structures, then I think it's just the case at the moment where we, at least here in the Baltics, need to rethink about the structures themselves. And then, I don't know, a good example of it is that we have run, when Estonia also celebrated its 100 years, we run a competition called Good Public Space, which is really a nice campaign. It's almost like 30th campaign of for president of taking care of small town and medieval middle town sized towns public plazas. So, but it's a kind of a competition which is taking city by city and making it taken care of. So my question rather would be is that do we need to do these things in a campaign? Mm-hmm. Do we also how we actually do the campaign? Is the usual architecture an urban plaza protocol the correct one? Is do we need to do these urban plazas in all of those places? Maybe we need to ask what is the structure actually. Maybe these bike highways are the actual plaza we need to redesign, or really need to think like how those rural areas are kind of connected actually. And so my observation just had been a little that we tend to think in a ways in those urban categories, also on the places which I think need new categories.
No, I think that's really interesting, and it links to us about, is it Little Oslo, where it looked exactly like Karachi in Pakistan, maybe, or Lahore, and I wonder, the public infrastructure that's set up there, does it allow for these kind of incidental interactions with people who are kind of migrants to the area, or with people who are kind of indigenous to Oslo? Like how much do people kind of bump into each other and have these connections, or are they kind of sectioned off in another area? You know, with the examples that you showed us in of the asylum seekers in Oslo, is that away from the city centre? Is it close to it? What is the relationship between recent migrants and population in the city who've been there for decades?
Yeah, I'm interested in this question of how does different architectures force us to reimagine different ways of being together, like you're asking. And with the architectures of remittances, I'm very interested in the way in which those forms of togetherness might not be about bodies that are together, but illusions or aspirations that kind of are congealed in those architectures. So the one I showed of in Mexico, for example, built with this mirrored glass that is like a technical invention exported just to show off, let's say, the kind of progress made in your destination to your family back home, or these kinds of different ways of producing togetherness that might not be about necessarily bodies, but money or aspirations or so. With the question, like where are, like some of these architectures play significant kind of disrupt many times traditional cities or villages, let's say, because they are many times not inhabited or inhabited in ways that disrupt local communities. But you were asking also about the location, for example, of the Asylum Seeker Center in relation to Little Karachi in Oslo. And of course, Little Karachi is part of the city center of Oslo. It's very much close to the center, while the asylum seeker is more towards the outside, because as I was mentioning, many of these asylum seeker centers are run by private commercial agents, not particularly that one, but they are all submitted to a system of commissions that are done through bidding to the government. So they have to offer the lowest bid in order to get those commissions, and that's how like many private companies started to get into that business. So they are putting asylum seekers in the middle of the forest in Norway, completely making impossible their incorporation into Norwegian life, getting jobs and being part of social life as we understand it to be built many times in places with certain density. So the question of the rural takes different forms, of course, but that in those situations becomes a place for displacement for these populations that are trying to be part of a new society, but they, just for the logics of profit, as I was mentioning, put in this cheaper but more distant location. So I think that's another way of linking the question about the rural and the urban with the logics of migration that has been kind of addressed throughout the day.
Yeah. Should we take some questions from the floor now? If there's any questions from the audience, we can carry on. Maybe we can bring this back to Latvia specifically. It was quite shocking to hear the discrimination in the housing market for the students and the stacks that Agnes showed us earlier in the day. And we also know that Latvia has a shrinking population and that immigration is far below emigration. So how can Latvia and other countries facing similar issues attract more migration? Is it something that needs to be policy and government-led? Does it need to be led by the people? Is it, tolerance and empathy. This is to the floor. Any answers?
For an easy answer, it has to be all of those things.
Yeah, all of the above.
No, but I do think I mean I don't know enough about Latvia or the Baltic states to really comment on this. But of course, in the end, it's all about politics. I mean, it's a very political and also contested thing, like how to deal with migration. But I also do think, and that's kind of a lesson that we learned from what happened in the Netherlands and in a lot of different Western European countries, was that being surprised by a big influx of people, or like just the factor of surprise, never works to your benefit. So if we look at the global trends, that there's a lot of people that are expected to move around the globe. I very much wonder if it's the smartest thing to do to kind of try to kind of ignore that fact. I think eventually there will be migration, and probably also to the Baltics, and it's better to prepare yourself for that and to channel that in the ways that it works to your benefit as well. Mm-hmm. So it's the only thing I can say about it. But
no, I agree. I think it's one of those a problem that all societies deal with, and it's that thing of, you know, you can't be what you can't see, or you can't empathize with something that you don't feel is related to you. So if it means more kind of black and brown faces on TV, on billboards, on you know, in your environment, if you're not living in a particularly culturally diverse area, maybe it needs to be less of a shock to see people who don't look like you in every facet of your life. Maybe that's the future for us, to just be more kind of not an advert. I mean, maybe that's just the thing in the UK.
That's what I'm also wondering now in Estonia, as Keiti was mentioning, that we had those injections inside of like smaller villages and cities to do the main square, to design the new main square. And I've been much more wondering, like, when or where do I meet in Tallinn the foreigners, or let's say foreign students? Then I meet them much more in a flux or in a movement of a street. So the square is not. Square is too much of an end destination, and I think like designing the main street, as we're also trying to do in Tallinn, because I just have to admit that mostly when I meet foreigners, they are either food delivery or they are cab drivers. So they're in a constant move, and I meet them on the street when they're driving by me or passing by me on a bike, and I think this main streets, or like the moments of movement. I mean, the same way how Walter Benjamin discussed the four ecologies of Los Angeles, that there's no squares, there's no public spaces. It's just the beach. Beach is a line that is the sort of the only public space in Los Angeles. So and I know that we just recently killed the idea of making the new main street of Tallinn, or it's at least on hold. But I think the designing the meeting point more as a movement, or like the vector rather than end point, is something that could maybe give us more interaction with them.
That's very interesting. So there's a question here. Do we have a mic?
Yes, I would like to comment on that, what you were just saying, or to your question, like how can we be more open? I'm a German. I'm living in Estonia, so I'm not really a foreigner. I don't look like a foreigner. I speak bad Estonian, so there's no problem. this morning we heard about the spiky world, and I think that's a very good expression, because if the world is getting more spiky, it means the world is more competitive, the world is more urban, and I think we have to think about this idea that everything that was discussed this morning about rurality and urbanity, if we put that on this discussion, then we have to be really honest and have to say, like, there is an urban world which works perfectly. I'm working in Tartu at the university. We have a study program. Half of the people are from Bangladesh, Nigeria, whatever. I asked them, do you feel safe in Tartu? They say, there's no discrimination. We go out with everyone. It's no problem. The same you can get from Eastern Germany if you have bigger cities or whatever. Once you walk 5 kilometers, everything is completely different because people feel that they're lost. They don't speak English. They have no idea about that. And at some point, they just turn this into a strategy of defense. So this is where we search for some kind of rural identity, but at the same time, we see that this doesn't really work. So what we have is actually, we have an urban world that works and that gets fueled by migration in every kind of way. Let it be the migration because of poverty or because of civil wars and whatever, and it works. And this whole peer group that is sitting here is connected to that. We don't have any problem about that. So we're not taking this discussion out. Once we go somewhere else, we don't have a solution for that anymore.
I'm going to have to push you for your question. Do you have a question, or is it
no, it's just a
statement?
Like a comment on that.
Okay, well, thank you. Do the panel have anything to say to respond to that? Do you agree? Thank you.
I mean, I'm not sure that the cities work so perfectly. I think there are lots of tensions. I mean, as you were saying, particularly for brown and black communities that are also in the cities constantly discriminated, even with violence. So I think it's important to understand how both through public space and the design of buildings, the development of policies and protocols of use, we kind of address those forms of discrimination or those forced processes of assimilation, because I don't see the urban machines so perfectly kind of oiled as you are describing it, because, particularly as I'm saying for people of color.
I can just affiliate as well. I have also all foreign students, but how my feedback is, for example, they've been cut from some funding because they haven't received their ID code yet. I'm going on a trip and then somebody's black facing them, or, making assaults. So it is different. It can be different, but it's true that,
Another question just here. Grey jumper.
Hello, I'm a master's student from Riga Technical University. My question is whether you see where architecture can be put somewhere between the permanent culture of, like here, let's say Latvia, with which we can welcome someone from outside with our stability and comfort them as like safe, stable, permanent space, and the other part, which is temporary structure, where people can build a new culture and create new experience within the place there are newcomers too. Do you think that architecture can be in this place in between those 2 points, and if that is, maybe you can elaborate on that?
Well, maybe I can say something about it, because I think there are, I mean, I don't exactly know how to bridge the, let's say, the cultural gap in this specific case, but I think that there is interesting examples of architecture that kind of leave space for interpretation and for your own, for own cultures to adapt to it. I'm directly thinking of the architecture by Aravena, who was curator of the Venice Architecture Biennale 3 years ago. And of course, he made this half houses, where of course there's one part that was kind of designed by the architect, and the other half could be filled in later on. And of course, that is kind of an example of how architecture can be not completely planning everything, but leaving things open for adaptation later on. There's also some really interesting examples in the Netherlands, in The Hague, where there was social housing produced, especially, for example, for immigrants coming from the Caribbean, creating houses that kind of, for example, in the Netherlands, a lot of kitchens are connected to the living room, and in these cultures, people find that annoying. So together with people with the backgrounds in the Caribbean, there were designs made that kind of fit their lifestyle and kind of facilitated their way of organizing a family.
And it's also interesting how you were showing in your presentation, or stating that we should be designing much more permanent structures for the newcomers, and saying permanent, it seemed like both of the examples were pretty much poured in concrete or put into like a certain materiality that says this is here to stay. And I'm wondering again, like what defines a permanent structure? Like, is lightweight structures, are they immediately then temporary ones? And we were just there was a recent study that there's as throughout the Soviet Union, when you were not allowed to use timber in public structures, like all those limestone concrete structures are now actually able to carry 2 more stories of lightweight structures on top of it. So we're discussing if should our national library have a 2 layers of timber structure on top of it to expand or propose a different program there, or maybe we can stack the whole Tallinn with like certain layering on top. So meaning that if you don't have a room or space to go horizontal, maybe there's potential in verticality with lightweight structures.
Maybe like I was thinking that paradoxically, maybe not addressing this question with architecture maybe is one of the solutions. Basically, like not trying to segregate with some kind of special strategy, but rather like actually integrating people in the environment, not much making notion of change. I mean, maybe paradoxically speaking, architectural interventions maybe would rather oppositely highlight or create problem more, like rather than making a solution. Maybe it's more of a soft management issue.
Maybe it's about architects using their skills to kind of build systems and processes, like you've all discussed in some ways, to integrate, but not necessarily. I mean, you've all shown how architecture contributes to our world at large without necessarily being built. And I think that's the beauty of our kind of multifaceted education in the world around architecture. It's about the social concerns, it's about structures, it's about environments, it's about histories. And that's a real celebration of the profession we're in, that it's not it's not singular. I think we're out of time unless there's any other burning questions. So thank you very much to our panel, and I think we hand back to the curators now.
I think we have to change the... Oh.
Dear audience, thank you those who have survived yesterday and today. We have come to conclusion. successfully. And I think that the conference actually is just the beginning of the conversation, just the beginning in the search for new tasks, new briefs. In this changing world, in the changing globe, in the planet in flux, in the Baltic Sea region in flux, in the Baltic states in flux. I would like to express my gratitude to Latvian Association of Architects who invited us to compile this program and for us to be able to have these discussions. Huge thanks goes to our speakers too, who were brave enough to come to this first time event.
Great. Towards the end, we're already sharing this. Yes, and of course, our common thanks goes to our supporters, State Cultural Capital Foundation, Nordic Council of Ministers Office in Latvia, LNK Group, UPB, Embassies of the Netherlands and Switzerland, European Commission representation in Latvia, Riga City Architects Office, and our partners, Colliers, Carguru, Air Baltic, Excelsior, and others. And of course, thank you to the team, management, communication, technical team, volunteers, catering, the venue providers. And I guess we should also thank each other. I'm doing that for both of us.
And thanks to Daniel too, who is somewhere around.
I am here.
And I think it has been a great 1-year journey through intellectual conversations all around between us, between you, the speakers, and the moderators. And we really, really, I think, have gained a lot. I think in the beginning of the conference, we had kind of idea or vision how we want to construct it and what we want to talk about. And now I feel that this backbone has filled with knowledge, like in depth. So it's really, I'm very happy to have come to this conclusion.
I'm looking at those two gentlemen standing there in front, Mr. Poga and Mr. Nikiforos, and they are actually behind this title of the conference, which we received and thought how to fulfill with the contents and how to think, how do we like to interpret this. So greetings also to them, and thank you.
And I would like to thank you, Dania and Dina, for creating this program, this amazing journey that we've been having, and this is for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I invite you to continue these discussions in a more informal atmosphere, having a glass of wine, some snacks. And I wanted to finish this all with the Justinian Tribulon saying, but since Meneesha already mentioned that in the panel, I would then just say that we are all migrants. Remember that, and I think this conference might have opened or all look towards the world. And yes, let's continue the conversations.